In Alias, you have the layer symmetry, and in Blender, you do not have the layer symmetry. However, you have the object center symmetry. And that is a modifier. So with my object selected, I could go to modifier and then generate and go to a mirror. And if I click it, you don't really see anything happening. If I click on Y, nothing happens. X, nothing happens. If I click on Z, you actually see that indeed something happens. And that is because X and Y, that creates a mirrored object, but because my cell phone by nature is built in a symmetrical way, they overlap the same space. So to make this, for example, visible, I could go into edit mode, and you see I have my Y and my X axis. And the object center point is extremely important when you use the mirror command. Because, let's try this out, I'm going to select all those points with my B selection tool. Then I press X to delete all my vertices. And you see there's my object. If I turn X off, you see I only have half of my object. If I turn X back on, that part then is visible. And if I select my model and, for example, move everything to the left, you can see actually that there is now a small gap. So the further the object is to the left, away from the object center, the same distance then my interactive mirrored object or clone is being moved away to the opposite direction. So you see, same also applies for all the stuff. So let me undo this. So to, of course, have a perfect match along the mirror line, it is imperative that your object center is perfectly lined up with my, kind of like the mirror axis geometry. So let's say by accident, you did something like this. Your points don't really line up. Well, that is not really a big deal, because first, let's move my 3D cursor to there. In object mode, I could press Shift S while having my object selected and say snap my cursor to my selected. And in object mode, snap to selected snaps to the pivot point or the origin point, like in Alias. And then I can go into edit mode and either select those points that are off or Alt left click on that loop cut and select everything. And then I could go to the pivot point, set it to 3D cursor, and then say scale along X and scale to the pivot point by pressing 0. I move them all along the X-axis to the pivot point. If I, for example, press S and 0, they all scale right to the 3D cursor. That is not what I want. I just want them to move along the X-axis towards the 3D cursor, which is why you have to press X in this case. And then you can left click. Now let's say, well, by accident, you have your whole shell removed. Well, and you don't really want to change your shell. I mean, you could go in and try to position it correctly, get very close, and then at this point, snap your mirror cross section to the object center point. Not really what you want to do, because that might change your design. But maybe instead we could snap the origin point now to my shell. So what we do here is in edit mode. For example, I select maybe this cross section. I could also simply select a point. It doesn't really matter that much. So I select my cross section, then I press spacebar, and then I type in ORI for origin. And then, for example, I, in edit mode, get the command set origin. Then I can, with my arrow keys or my mouse, go to set origin. And as you can see, it's also Shift Control Alt C. So you can do it this way or Shift Control Alt C. And then it asks you to set my origin point to my geometry, or origin to the geometry, or geometry to origin, or origin to the 3D cursor. And what I would like to do is, first, I forgot that, sorry. I have to snap my 3D cursor to my selection. So cursor to selection. And because I am inside edit mode, I put my 3D cursor to where my selected geometry is. Okay. And then Shift Control Alt C. And now I can say move my origin to where the 3D cursor is. Press enter. And then Blender tells you can't perform this in edit mode. So we would have to leave edit mode, go into object mode because we move the origin point of our object. Shift Control Alt C, or use the spacebar menu, click, and then you see that origin point was moved to where the cross section is, where my 3D cursor was positioned, and then this way my mirror effect perfectly lines up. Well, now my object is actually off the grid, so to reposition it correctly, I could press N to open the transform panel and into, for example, X and Y, I type in 0, and then my object is perfectly centered along the X and Y axis again. Okay, so I hope this was not too confusing, but it's very important to understand how the mirror tool works in relationship to the object origin point. Now let's take a look at the quality of our geometry result, and you see there's a small pinch up here. Not really desirable, so what could be a possible reason? Well, if we go back to the modifier tab, you will see that we have a specific order. So we have this object, and that object we apply a subdivision surface modifier to, and then this half we flip over. So this sharp point here, of course, will be flipped over, but no, I would like to have something that is similar to the symmetry tangency. So like in Alias, it's called implied tangency or implied curvature. Well, to do this, I need to have my subdivision surface modifier applied at the end. So first I create out of this half a full object, and then I apply the smoothing. And to do this, I just have to change the order here. See, there's a small up and down arrow, and if you click on it, you can change the order or sequence in which each modifier is being calculated. So now I have my half object, and that is then being completed into a full object, and onto that full geometry object I apply my subdivision surface modifier. Okay. Well, let's say you also would like to have the y-axis being possible to be used. Currently, my object or my mesh is built in a way so that, for example, I have only a left to right symmetry, but not a bottom symmetry. So to do this, all I need is just 1/4 of my model. But the problem is, if I select all those points and delete it, I end up with this part. So what I need to do is, right here, I need to add another cross section. So I can go to loop cut and then click. I can either press escape so I don't move it by accident, or I can press 0. 0 in this case means it is centered at the edge. Let me do this again and click. And lower left corner, you see there is something called edge slide. And if I go to 0, you see that's the center of this edge. And then positive is sliding it up and negative is sliding it down to the other side. So if I press escape or 0, it centers it. Then I can select this edge or all those vertices and simply delete them. And then turn Y on. And now I have a model where, for example, all I need to do is work on 1/4 of my model. And then alias is, and Blender is actually, with the modifier, updating all the other 4 corners for me. So instead of, for example, working on the complete model, here I only work on a 1/4 part of my model, and that saves me, in case it's a very symmetrical object, for example, a lot of click jobs. So that's the way how you use the mirror modifier.